Does a mark define a soul? In the parched hills of Andalusia, where the Sierra Nevadas peaks jagged the fierce blue sky like broken teeth, such questions were answered before they were asked. In the village of Almendro, nestled amidst olive groves scarred by the recent wars, difference was a sin whispered behind cupped hands, a shadow stretched long by the unwavering sun of faith and fear. Here lived Isadora. Her existence was woven into the fabric of the village. Yet she remained perpetually on its fringe, an outlier defined by the splash of deep crimson across her left cheek and neck. La Mancha, the stain. Born with it, she wore the village's interpretation like a shroud. Ill omen, witch's mark, God's displeasure made manifest in the tumultuous years following Granada's fall. It wasn't ugly, not truly, no more than a poppy petal or wine spilled on cream linen, but context was everything. In Almendro, it was a brand. She found her voice not in speech, which drew averted eyes, but in the rhythmic clatter of her loom. In her small, whitewashed cottage perched just beyond the last cluster of houses, threads became her confidantes. Wool, dyed with hoarded cochineal and stubborn indigo, transformed under her nimble fingers into patterns far more complex and vibrant than the life allotted to her. Geometric echoes of Moorish tiles, birds yearning for flight, mazes reflecting the tangled paths of her thoughts. She wove her inner landscape onto tapestries that spoke of a beauty the villagers refused to see in her face. Her father, a man hollowed by loss and hardship, offered silence, not solace. Her mother was a faded memory, claimed by fever years ago. Only old Elia, now gone too, had shown her the magic of the loom, a legacy of quiet defiance. Loneliness was a constant companion, yet Isadora possessed a resilience as tough and enduring as the ancient olive trees. She moved through the village with a quiet reserve, her gaze often lowered, not in shame but in weariness of the constant scrutiny. She bartered her weaving for necessities, her interactions brief, polite, guarded. Senora Elena, the village's matriarch of judgment, watched her with eyes like obsidian chips, missing nothing, suspecting everything. Padre Ignacio, the priest, offered hesitant smiles and murmured blessings, torn between doctrine that frowned upon superstition and the ingrained fear that permeated his flock. Isadora expected little. Acceptance was a foreign country she only glimpsed in the intricate worlds she created thread by thread. Her goal was simpler: peace, the hum of the loom, the scent of herbs drying in the rafters. One sweltering afternoon, driven by the need for specific plants whose roots yielded the best yellow dye, Isadora ventured higher into the rocky foothills than usual. The air thrummed with cicadas, the scent of wild thyme and sun-baked earth filled her lungs. She moved with practiced steps over the treacherous terrain, her focus on the ground, searching. Then a flicker of unnatural colour against the grey stone. Not a flower, but cloth. Dark, stained cloth. And beneath it, stillness. Hesitantly she approached. Flies buzzed. The scent of blood, metallic and stark, cut through the herbal air. A man lay sprawled, half hidden by a cluster of gnarled oaks. He wore the remnants of good-quality clothing, now torn and dirtied, leather boots scuffed and worn. One hand was flung out, palm up, fingers curled slightly. His face was turned away, but she could see the unnatural pallor beneath the grime and stubble, the shallow, ragged rise and fall of his chest. A discarded waterskin lay nearby, empty. He was no shepherd. The way he lay, the stillness broken only by shallow breaths, spoke of exhaustion and injury, not peaceful rest. Fear prickled Isadora's skin. Soldiers, bandits, fugitives, the roads were still unsafe. Her instinct screamed retreat. Leave him. This was not her concern. Involvement meant questions, suspicion directed her way. She took a step back, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. But then a low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure agony that snagged at something deep within her. It was the sound of suffering, stripped bare of identity or allegiance. It echoed her own quiet pains. She saw not a soldier or a stranger, but simply a fellow human being hovering on the edge. The village's judgment faded, replaced by an older, simpler imperative. Compassion, sharp and undeniable. Could she walk away? Leave him to the sun, the flies, the inevitable end? The threads of her own humanity tangled with his. No, she couldn't. The decision settled, heavy but certain. She knelt beside him, the scent of blood stronger now, her shadow falling across his still form. The first thread of connection, fragile and dangerous, had been spun. Moving him was a nightmare. He was heavier than he looked. a dead weight of muscle and bone. She wasn't strong, relying on leverage and desperation. The sun beat down mercilessly as she half dragged, half carried him towards the closest refuge she knew, an abandoned shepherd's hut, tumble-down and forgotten, hidden in a fold of the hills screened by dense carob trees. It wasn't far, but each step was agony. Sweat plastered her hair to her temples, mingling with the dust. Her muscles screamed. Twice she nearly dropped him, but the rhythmic rasp of his breathing, however faint, spurred her on. Inside the hut, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and old goat droppings. She eased him onto a pile of dry, brittle straw in the corner, his head lolling back. Now, the assessment. Gently, she cut away the torn fabric of his tunic. A deep gash ran across his ribs, crudely bound with a strip of cloth soaked through with dried blood. Another wound, angrier looking, marred his thigh. Fever radiated from his skin. His lips were cracked and dry. He needed water, cleaning, tending. Secrecy was paramount. She fetched water from the hidden spring nearby, using her shawl folded into a makeshift carrier. Back in her cottage, heart still hammering, she gathered supplies. Clean linen strips torn from worn sheets, dried rosemary and lavender for cleansing. Plantain leaves she knew helped staunch bleeding, a small jar of precious olive oil. Each item felt heavy with risk. Returning under the cover of the deepening dusk, she moved like a ghost through the familiar landscape, every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark, setting her nerves on edge. She cleaned his wounds as best she could by the fading light filtering through the hut's dilapidated roof. His skin flinched under her touch, but he didn't wake. She dribbled water onto his lips, watching a little trickle past the corner of his mouth. She applied poultices of crushed herbs and bound the wounds tightly with the clean linen. His breathing seemed a fraction easier, or perhaps it was just her desperate hope. Sitting back on her heels, the enormity of what she had done washed over her. She was sheltering a stranger, a wounded man who could bring untold trouble. Yet looking at his vulnerable, unconscious face, she felt no regret, only a profound sense of responsibility. She stayed until the moon rose high, watching him, listening to the night sounds, before slipping away back to her cottage, her secret held tight within her like a fragile bird. Matteo surfaced from darkness into a world of throbbing pain and fractured light. His first coherent thought was thirst, a raw scraping in his throat. Then came the awareness of his body. A dull fire along his ribs, a sharper agony in his leg. He tried to move, a groan tearing from his lips as white-hot lances shot through him. Where was he? Not the battlefield. Not the ditch where he'd finally collapsed after Gaspar and his men had cornered him. This place smelled of earth and old straw. He blinked, trying to focus. Motes danced in the slivers of sunlight piercing the gloom. Rough stone walls, a crumbling roof. A hut. Slowly, memories returned like shards of broken glass. The ambush outside Ronda. Fighting his way clear, Gaspar's snarling face, riding until his horse gave out, stumbling through the hills bleeding, delirious. Then nothing, until now. He tried to sit up, biting back another cry. His wounds, they were bound, cleanly. Someone had found him. Panic tightened his chest. Who? Gaspar's men? Unlikely. They wouldn't have bothered with bandages. Villagers? Dangerous. Questions would be asked. Explanations demanded. He needed to leave, disappear again. He pushed himself up, ignoring the screaming protest of his muscles, managing only to prop himself on one elbow before dizziness overwhelmed him, the dim hut spinning around him. He fell back, gasping, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. Trapped, helpless. The old cynicism, his shield against a brutal world, curdled within him. Trust no one. Rely on nothing. A shadow fell across the doorway. Matteo tensed, hand instinctively reaching for a sword that wasn't there. A woman entered, carrying a small clay jug and a bundle wrapped in cloth. She moved quietly, almost hesitantly. When she turned towards him, the light caught her face. He saw the mark first, a startling splash of crimson covering half her cheek, vivid against her olive skin. La Mancha. He'd seen such marks before, heard the whispers that followed those who bore them. Witchcraft, bad luck. He instinctively recoiled, suspicion hardening his gaze. Was this some trick? She stopped a few paces away, her dark eyes meeting his briefly before flicking away. There was no malice in them, only caution. Perhaps pity. She knelt, placing the jug and bundle on the dirt floor. Without a word, she dipped a strip of cloth into the water and gently offered it to his lips. He hesitated, then drank greedily, the cool liquid easing the fire in his throat. She moistened the cloth again and carefully wiped the grime and sweat from his face. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, impersonal yet undeniably kind. She unwrapped the bundle. Simple bread, a piece of goat cheese, a handful of olives. Food. She broke off a piece of bread and held it out. He stared at it, then at her. Why? Why was she helping him? A marked woman, an outcast herself by the look of it, risking trouble for a wounded stranger. It made no sense in the world he knew, where kindness was a currency rarely offered without expectation of return. Yet her actions seemed devoid of guile. He took the bread, his fingers brushing hers. Her hand was steady, calloused slightly, likely from hard work. She checked his bandages, her movements efficient, practiced. She applied a fresh, cool poultice that smelled faintly of herbs, easing some of the burning. She did it all with a quiet focus, rarely meeting his eyes, as if concentrating solely on the task. He watched her, the suspicion slowly warring with a grudging curiosity. He saw the way she carried herself, a certain dignity despite the mark that drew stares. He saw the neatness of her simple clothes, the competence in her hands. There was a stillness about her, a self-containment that intrigued him. She wasn't asking questions, she wasn't prying, she was simply helping. It was unsettling. It was unexpected. When she finished, she gathered her things and left as quietly as she had come, leaving Matteo alone with his pain, his confusion, and the lingering scent of rosemary. Days bled into one another, measured by the woman's quiet visits. She brought water, food, fresh herbs for his wounds. She never stayed long, never pressed him with questions. Sometimes Matteo would try to speak, a rough gracias, but she would just nod, her gaze skittering away. He learned her name was Isadora only by overhearing a snippet of conversation when she thought he was asleep, someone calling her name from a distance, a tone laced with something that wasn't friendly. He grew stronger, the fever receding, the wounds beginning to itch with healing. He could sit up now, propped against the rough wall, and observe more. He saw the fatigue in her eyes sometimes, the way she glanced nervously towards the path before entering the hut. He realized the risk she was taking grew with every day he remained. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and unwelcome. He was putting this strange, silent woman in danger. One afternoon, she was late. Anxiety, an unfamiliar emotion, coiled in Matteo's gut. He strained his ears, listening for her light footsteps. The silence stretched. Had she been discovered? Had she decided the risk was too great? When she finally appeared, there was a faint bruise blooming on her temple, partially hidden by her dark hair. She moved with even more caution than usual, her face pale. She offered no explanation, tending to him with her usual quiet efficiency, but her hands trembled slightly as she changed his dressings. Seeing that tremor, that sign of vulnerability, ignited a flicker of something fierce in Matteo. Protectiveness. It startled him. He, who had walked away from everything, who sought only to be left alone, felt a primitive urge to shield this woman who showed him undeserved kindness. "What happened?" he asked, his voice raspy but firm. Isadora flinched, her eyes widening slightly. She shook her head, murmuring, "Nada. It is nothing." She turned away, busying herself with tidying the meager supplies. But Matteo saw the lie, saw the fear she tried to mask. He didn't press, sensing it would only distress her more. But the incident lodged itself in his mind. He started watching the path from the hut's doorway, a useless guardian in his weakened state. But the instinct remained. He began to see the village, glimpsed through the trees, not as a potential source of danger for himself, but for her. He saw the way other figures hurried past her cottage, the way children sometimes pointed. He saw her isolation, mirrored in the stark crimson mark on her face, and recognized it as a deeper wound than any he carried. He started to see Isadora, not the Mancha, but the woman beneath, resilient, compassionate, and utterly alone. Isadora knew the whispers grew louder. Senora Elena's gaze seemed sharper, lingering longer when Isadora passed through the tiny plaza. Twice, the old woman had made pointed remarks about Isadora needing extra lamp oil, her tone implying late-night activities beyond weaving. "Working so hard, child?" she'd asked, her smile thin as a knife edge. Or perhaps entertaining visitors. Isadora had murmured something non-committal, her cheeks burning, not with shame, but with the heat of her secret. Even Padre Ignacio seemed troubled. He stopped her after the sparse Sunday service, his brow furrowed. "Isadora, my child," he began, fumbling with the wooden beads of his rosary. "Take care. The village. People talk easily. Do not give them reason." It was meant as a warning, perhaps kindly, but it felt like another tightening knot of fear around her. She needed more linen for bandages, more food for Matteo. Her own supplies dwindled. Each trip to the village felt like walking through a field of hidden snares. One morning, needing coarse thread she couldn't spin herself, she had to barter a small, intricately woven pouch at the stall of the village's general merchant. Signora Elena was there, haggling over the price of dried beans. As Isadora completed her transaction, Elena turned her sharp eyes on her. "Another pretty thing," she commented, gesturing towards the pouch Isadora had exchanged. "You weave constantly, such industry, almost unnatural." The implication hung heavy in the air. Isadora clutched her purchase and fled, the woman's suspicious gaze boring into her back. She recounted the incident to Matteo later, not as a complaint, but as a sigh of weariness, sinking onto the packed earth floor of the hut. He listened, his face grim, jaw tight. He saw the lines of strain around her eyes, the way she unconsciously touched the bruise, now faded, on her temple. "You should not risk yourself further for me," he said, his voice low. "I am strong enough now. I can move on." Isadora looked up, startled. The thought of him leaving sent a pang of unexpected loss through her. He had become a fixture in her solitary existence, a shared secret, a focus for her care. "You are not strong enough," she stated quietly, matter-of-factly. "The leg wound still pains you. And where would you go?" He had no answer. He was still weak, still hunted. Gaspar would not give up easily. He looked at Isadora, truly looked at her. He saw past the crimson mark, saw the steadfast loyalty in her dark eyes, the quiet determination that belied her gentle manner. She possessed a strength he, the seasoned knight, had never truly known, the strength of endurance, of compassion in the face of cruelty. He had faced down armed men, stormed walls, survived battles, but Isadora survived the slow, grinding attrition of daily prejudice, and she did it without bitterness, offering kindness to a broken stranger. A fragile intimacy grew in the confines of the hut. They spoke more, sharing stories, hers hesitant tales of plants and weaving patterns, his carefully edited recollections of travel, omitting the violence, focusing on landscapes or cities seen long ago. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm crashed around them. Rain lashed down, turning the world outside into a grey torrent. Lightning briefly illuminated the hut, followed by deafening thunder. Matteo flinched violently, his hand instinctively going to where his sword hilt would be, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the storm. A memory, sharp and visceral, the flash of cannon fire, the roar of battle, the screams. Isadora saw it. She didn't speak, didn't pry. She simply sat near him, her presence a quiet anchor in the turmoil. After a moment she began to hum softly, a simple, repetitive folk melody, the sound almost lost beneath the rain's drumming. Slowly the tension eased from Matteo's shoulders, the haunted look faded from his eyes. He looked at her, a silent gratitude passing between them. In that shared moment of vulnerability, the distance between the marked weaver and the haunted knight shrank further. He reached out, his rough fingers hesitating before gently tracing the edge of the crimson mark on her cheek. It was warm, soft skin. Just skin. Not a curse, not a stain. Just Isadora. She didn't pull away, meeting his gaze steadily for the first time, a flicker of surprise and something else. Hope? In her dark eyes. The storm raged outside, but within the small hut a fragile peace began to take root. The fragile peace shattered like sun-dried clay. News arrived in Almendro not on the wind, but on horseback, embodied by a man whose presence radiated menace even from across the dusty plaza. Isadora saw him first from the doorway of the merchant's stall, where she'd gone for more oil. He was thick-set, dressed in worn but serviceable leather, a jagged scar bisecting one eyebrow. He carried himself with a swagger that spoke of violence barely contained. He was questioning the merchant, his voice low but carrying an edge that made people edge away. Isadora didn't need to hear the words, the way the merchant gestured vaguely towards the hills, the way the stranger's eyes scanned the landscape with hungry intensity. She knew. Trouble had found them. She hurried back towards her cottage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She took the winding path towards the hut, moving quickly but trying to remain unseen. She found Matteo outside, testing his leg, leaning against the rough stone wall. The wound was healing well, but he still favoured it. "A man," she gasped, breathless. "In the village, asking questions. About a soldier. He has a scar." She described the stranger. Matteo's face went pale beneath his tan. He straightened up, his hand automatically going to his side, finding only empty air. "Gaspar." He breathed the name a curse. He met Isadora's frightened gaze, his own eyes hardening. I knew he wouldn't give up. Hope so recently kindled died in his chest, replaced by the cold, familiar weight of his past. "He was my lieutenant," Matteo explained grimly, seeing the question in her eyes. "During the war, we disagreed. About spoils, about methods. He believes I cheated him, that I know the location of something valuable taken from a Moorish palace near Granada. He's relentless and ruthless." The air grew thick with unspoken fear. Gaspar wouldn't just question, he would search, threaten, tear the village apart if necessary, and he would eventually find the hut. Find Matteo, find Isadora. "You must go," Isadora whispered, urgency replacing her fear. "Now, while you still can. Take the paths higher into the Sierra. He might not follow so far." Matteo looked at her, then around the humble hut that had become his sanctuary. He looked towards the village, picturing Gaspar's scarred face, his greedy eyes. Leaving meant abandoning Isadora to face Gaspar's questions, his potential wrath when he found his quarry gone. Staying meant bringing violence to her doorstep, destroying the fragile peace she had so carefully guarded. He thought of her quiet strength, her undeserved kindness, the hesitant hope he'd seen in her eyes. He couldn't leave her. Not like this. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I will not run further. Not from him, and I will not leave you to face him alone." The decision felt less like courage and more like inevitability. He owed her that much. He owed himself that much, to make a stand, not as the knight he once was, but as the man she had helped him become. He met her gaze, his own reflecting a grim determination. "He will come here. We must be ready." The confrontation came sooner than they expected. Dusk was settling, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, when Gaspar appeared at the edge of the clearing surrounding the hut. He moved with predatory confidence, his scarred face set in a triumphant sneer. He wasn't alone. 2 other rough-looking men flanked him, swords loose in their scabbards. "Matteo," Gaspar called out, his voice dripping with false camaraderie. "Hiding in a hovel? Befriending the local witch?" His eyes flicked dismissively towards Isadora, who stood frozen near the doorway, her face pale but resolute. I heard whispers, the marked woman playing nursemaid. Touching. Matteo stepped forward, positioning himself between Gaspar and Isadora. He was unarmed, save for a sturdy piece of wood he'd been using as a crutch, now gripped tightly in his hand. His leg throbbed, a painful reminder of his weakness. "Leave her out of this, Gaspar," Matteo said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is between us." Gaspar laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, it involves her now. She hid you, aided a fugitive. Perhaps she knows where you hid the Emir's jewels, eh? Tell me. Tell me, and maybe I let the witch live." He drew his sword, its polished surface catching the last rays of sunlight. His men fanned out slightly, cutting off any escape. Matteo's mind raced. 3 armed men. He was injured, effectively unarmed. Direct combat was suicide. But surrender meant death, or worse, capture and torture, and it meant Isadora would suffer. He looked back at her, a silent question in his eyes. Her gaze met his, steady now, a spark of defiance in their depths. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No surrender." "There are no jewels, Gaspar," Matteo said, stalling, his eyes darting around the small clearing, searching for any advantage. "You chase phantoms." "Liar!" Gaspar lunged, faster than his bulk suggested. Matteo sidestepped awkwardly, bringing the heavy wooden crutch around in a sweeping arc. Gaspar blocked it easily with his sword arm, the impact jarring Matteo's shoulder. One of Gaspar's men moved in from the side, sword raised. Just as the man swung, something whipped through the air. A thick, heavy rope, weighted at one end, snaked around the man's legs, pulling taut. He yelped in surprise, crashing heavily to the ground, his sword skittering away. Isadora stood near the hut's entrance, the other end of the rope, a lead line from her weaving supplies, gripped firmly in her hands. Her face was set, her eyes blazing. The distraction gave Matteo a precious second. He shoved hard against Gaspar. using his opponent's momentum to send him stumbling back. The third man hesitated, momentarily confused by his companion's sudden fall. Matteo didn't wait. He swung the crutch again, this time aiming low, catching the third man hard across the shins. The man howled and buckled. Gaspar roared in fury, recovering his balance. He ignored his downed men and charged Matteo again, sword aimed at his heart. Matteo parried desperately with the crutch, the wood groaning under the impact of steel. He knew he couldn't hold out long. His legs screamed in protest. His arms burned with the strain. Then Isadora moved again. She darted back inside the hut for a heartbeat, emerging with something large and unwieldy. A heavy wooden beam detached from her loom. With a cry born of desperation and fury, she swung it with all her might, not at Gaspar himself, but at the rocky overhang just above him. The beam struck the loose stones with a crack. Rocks and dirt showered down, striking Gaspar's head and shoulders. He staggered back, momentarily blinded and stunned, dropping his sword with a clang. Matteo didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, using the crutch to hook Gaspar's ankle, pulling sharply. The larger man went down hard, hitting his head against a rock. He lay still. The two other men, one tangled in rope, the other nursing his shins, stared in disbelief, their aggression dissolving into fear. Seeing their leader down, they scrambled away, disappearing into the gathering gloom. Silence fell, broken only by heavy breathing and the chirping of crickets. Matteo leaned heavily on the crutch, looking at Gaspar's unconscious form, then at Isadora. She stood trembling, the heavy loom beam still clutched in her hands, dust smudging the crimson mark on her cheek. Her ingenuity, her courage, had saved them. She hadn't used magic, only her tools, her knowledge of her surroundings, and a fierceness he hadn't known she possessed. They tied Gaspar securely with more of Isadora's sturdy ropes. Matteo felt a profound wariness, not just physical, but soul-deep. He hadn't killed. He had defended, yes, but the final blow, the decisive action, had been Isadora's, clever and non-lethal. Looking at Gaspar's unconscious face, Matteo felt no triumph, only a vast, aching relief. The cycle of violence, for now, was broken. News of the captured bandit, for that was how Gaspar was presented, a lone brigand causing trouble, spread through Almendro with cautious excitement. Matteo, with Isadora's quiet testimony supporting his claim of self-defense, explained Gaspar was a rogue he'd encountered on the road, who had tracked him seeking vengeance for some imagined slight. He omitted their shared past, the jewels, the true depth of the threat. Padre Ignacio, seeing the bound man and hearing Isadora speak with newfound confidence, offered prayers of thanks for their deliverance. Signora Elena, observing the scene with her sharp eyes, noted Isadora's steady demeanor, the way Matteo deferred to her account, the palpable bond between them. She sniffed, but offered a grudging nod. "Seems the girl has some spirit after all," she muttered to another villager, loud enough for Isadora to overhear. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall of prejudice. Gaspar was handed over to the rudimentary authority of the nearest town's magistrate, his fate uncertain, but no longer their immediate concern. The shadow he cast began to recede. In the quiet aftermath, Matteo knew he couldn't leave. His flight was over. The peace he sought wasn't in disappearing, but in staying here with the woman who had shown him what true strength looked like. One evening, sitting outside the cottage as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Matteo finally spoke the words that had been forming in his heart. "Isadora," he began, his voice quiet. "My past, it brought danger to you. I understand if you wish me gone." Isadora turned from watching the loom inside, now silent. "Your past is part of you, Matteo, as La Mancha is part of me. It does not define all that you are." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing gently over hers. "I have known only war, suspicion, running. You showed me kindness. You showed me courage. I want to stay, not as a knight or a fugitive, just as Matteo, to learn peace, to help you if you will let me." He hesitated, then added, "I see no mark when I look at you, Isadora. I see only you." Tears welled in Isadora's eyes, blurring the starlight. Not tears of sadness, but of release, of a hope she'd long thought buried. She didn't need grand pronouncements or royal rewards. She needed this. Acceptance, seen for who she was, valued for her spirit. Her fingers tightened around his. "Stay, Matteo," she whispered. "There is peace to be found here, together." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. The air smelled of dust and cooling earth, of the wild herbs Isadora tended beside her door. The rhythmic chirp of crickets filled the air. Prejudice wouldn't vanish from Almendro overnight. Whispers might still follow her, but they no longer held the same power. In the sanctuary they had built together, founded on mutual respect and quiet courage, they had found their own acceptance. The threads of their lives, once frayed and solitary, were now weaving together, creating a new pattern, strong and beautiful in its unexpected design, a quiet testament to the enduring truth that inner worth shines brighter than any superficial mark.